And we're going to be talking about someone tonight in our judges class who is not a judge, Abimelech. And Abimelech has a large portion that is devoted to him and his exploits, which is interesting because there are several judges that are mentioned in the book of Judges, which you would think that judges in the book of Judges would have a pretty good size talking about what they did, their importance. But here you can see at the beginning of Judges, and even after this takes place in chapter 10, you have two judges that are mentioned, both of which that ruled over 20 years, and they're given one verse apiece. And yet Abimelech is not even a judge, and he's given an entire chapter. In fact, one of the longest chapters in the book of Judges. And so it's interesting to see so much time devoted to Abimelech and what takes place. Now, going off what we talked about last week, does anybody remember who Abimelech is? Who is he? He's Gideon's son. That's exactly right. Does anybody remember how many sons Gideon had? He had 70 legitimate sons, right? We don't know how many illegitimate sons, but we know at least one of them, and his name is Abimelech. And Abimelech means what? Yeah, my father is king, right? And we talked about that at the end of last week's lesson, whether or not Gideon thought of himself and acted as if he was a Canaanite king in that region. And so here we see in Judges chapter 9, we're going to be told about Abimelech and his rise to power after the void takes place with Gideon's death. And so let's go ahead and let's read Judges chapter 9, verses 1 through 6 of our text. Judges 9, 1 through 6. Now Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, which is Gideon, went to Shechem and his mother's relatives, and he said to them, and to the whole clan of his mother's family, say in the ears of all the leaders of Shechem, which is better for you, that all 70 sons of Jerubbaal rule over you, or that one rule over you? Remember also, I am your bone and your flesh. And his mother's relatives spoke all these words on his behalf in the ears of all the leaders of Shechem, and their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is our brother. And they gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal-berith, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless fellows who followed him. And he went to his father's house in Orpha, and he killed his brothers and the sons of Jerubbaal, 70 men on one stone. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left, for he hid himself. And all the leaders of Shechem came together, and all at Beth Millo, and they went and made Abimelech king by the oak of the pillar at Shechem. And so here we have in verses 1 through 6 about Abimelech. Now Abimelech is the illegitimate child of Gideon, as you have already said, and his mother was a Canaanite. And of course we know that Moses said, number 1, don't marry foreigners. Number 2, drive my land. Well, Gideon doesn't drive the Canaanites out of the land, and in fact he has a son with a Canaanite woman, which causes problems for his own legitimate sons. And so the 70 legitimate sons were in place to rule over the surrounding area. Now I mentioned what we said before, Gideon seemed to act like a king, and the people of Shechem are under the understanding that his sons are going to have some power struggle. And so it seems like Gideon did act like some type of ruler, if not a king, at least some sort of local magistrate, because Abimelech's whole deal with them is, it's better to have one ruler than 70. And I can be the ruler for you guys if you would like me to. Just remember, I'm also a Canaanite with you. And so Abimelech wants to take his father's place. And so he goes and he kills 79 of his 70 half-brothers. And so this is financed by Baal-berith, which is God of the covenant. This is not Yahweh, this is a Canaanite god. And so he is financed by a pagan temple. Now, as you read the story of Abimelech, there's no indication whatsoever that he is a worshiper of Yahweh, that he is a righteous man. In fact, the story of Abimelech shows us that he's actually a pretty wicked individual, and he is financed through a pagan temple. What kind of men does he hire? What does the text tell us these men are like? Reckless, worthless. Anybody have any other words to describe them in your translations? Is that pretty much the standard? Who do you think these guys were? Criminals, yeah. Mercenaries, right? Hired soldiers of fortune, I guess is what you would call them. Men that don't really fight for a purpose other than the purse, right? The gold that can be given to them. Think they were Canaanites or Israelites? The text doesn't say. It could have been Canaanites because Abimelech acts like Canaanite. He's half Canaanite. He's going to a Canaanite city saying, follow me. But if you go down to verse 55, it says the men of Israel followed him, and that when he died, the men of Israel turned away. And so it's interesting. Maybe these worthless men were Israelites. It wouldn't be too far-fetched because the Israelites have not had the best picture painted throughout the first 9 chapters of the book of Judges. But here we're just not exactly sure, but we do know they were worthless men. And so he becomes a military commander after the image of his father Gideon. And so it is interesting here that Jotham, his brother, we'll see here in a moment, he doesn't get to kill. And so he takes this money from the pagan temple, he uses it to buy mercenaries, and then he goes and he kills his brothers at one stone. And so he probably was a concerted effort to get all of his brothers in one place and kill them at one time. The interesting thing is that Abimelech is the first Israelite king. Now, your Sunday school teachers may have told you that who was the first Israelite king? Saul, right? That's the first Israelite king that God appointed, but Abimelech is half Israelite. And we know that the Israelites followed him. We know he had territory. And so it's interesting here that the first technically Israelite king is actually Abimelech, but he's crowned by Canaanites. But he's also followed by Israelites that we'll later see in the later part of the chapter. And so it's interesting here that these men decide that Abimelech's going to be their king. Any questions or comments on verses 1 through 6?
Did they kill their brothers? I know it's not the only time this has happened. Because of threats for their reign?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so it seems here like he didn't want any competition. And so in the ancient world, one of the best ways to end competition to who's going to be dad's successor is to kill all your brothers and sisters. Now, thank heavens we have a little bit more civil discourse today, but I've seen farms split up between kids where it seemed like it may transgress into something about as bad as Abimelech. But I know that happens in Robertson County, not Marshall County, so I don't know anything about that. But I'm afraid that sometimes human nature hasn't changed too much. Great question. Any other questions or comments?
How do we think that times are bad today? That people are getting worse and worse and worse?
Yeah.
All you got to do is open the Bible, read.
It's true. Statistically, we live in the most peaceful time in human history. And so we lament sometimes about how terrible the world is today. But even in the last 150 years, I'm not even talking about in the whole swath of recorded history, but that would be included. We live in the safest, most peaceful time. The average life expectancy in the U.S. is over 80 years. Once you factor out, child mortality rates. I mean, it's amazing. We live in a good time. We're very blessed. Absolutely. Absolutely. Brittany made a suggestion that I thought was a good suggestion. She said, Isaac, you blow through the historical stuff and you get to the end and you try to take the takeaways in 2.5 minutes, or 2.5 seconds, really. And so we'll come to that in a second. Here's Shechem. If you can see here on our map, this is the Bible lands we're talking about. You can see Judea there at the bottom. You can see Samaria at the top. And there you can kind of see Shechem right there. Now Shechem is going to be an extremely important city in the history of the Israelites and the Samaritan people. Here is a modern day picture of Shechem. On the left-hand side, you can see Mount Gerizim. Now, Mount Gerizim is important because we're going to hear about Mount Gerizim in just a second. On the right side is Mount Elba. And so here you have these two mountains. And in between these mountains, you have the city of Shechem. The city of Shechem is one of the oldest cities in the world. In fact, it is still inhabited today, as you can see by these pictures. And so Shechem is an important place. It's a place that you can go visit if you ever do go over those sites. Here's another picture that shows the two mountain ranges with the modern-day city of Shechem right there in between those two mountain ranges. The reason why Shechem was so important was because after the Assyrian conquest, Shechem really becomes kind of the capital city of the northern tribe of Israel. And we'll come back to that in just a second. But our takeaway here is ambition and self-exaltation lead to destruction. And so Abimelech thought that he needed to have ambition. And he needed to exalt himself to be a leader of men. And that because he was going to exalt himself, that he was going to have whatever he was looking for. Money, wealth, power, fame, fortune, carry on daddy's legacy, whatever it was. But as we can see here, that this led to destruction instead of self-exaltation. And so then we have his brother, the one he didn't kill, Jotham's parable. And so if you want to, let's read verses 7 through 21. 7 through 21. When it was told to Jotham, he went and stood on the top of Mount Gerizim, the mountain we just saw. And he cried aloud and said to them, "Listen to me, you leaders of Shechem, that God may listen to you. The trees once went out to anoint a king over them. And they said to the olive tree, 'Reign over us.' But the olive tree said to them, 'Shall I leave my abundance which the gods and men are honored, and go hold sway over the trees?' And the tree said to the fig tree, 'You come and reign over us.' But the fig tree said to them, 'Shall I leave my sweetness and my good fruit and hold sway over the trees?' And the tree said to the vine, 'You come and reign over us.' But the vine said to them, 'Shall I leave my wine that cheers God and men and go hold sway over the trees?' Then all the trees said to the bramble, 'You come and reign over us.' And the bramble said to the trees, 'If in good faith you are anointing me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon.' Now therefore, if you acted in good faith and integrity when you made Abimelech king, if you have dealt well with Jerubbaal and the house and have done him as deserved, for my father fought for you and risked his life and delivered you from the hand of the Midianites, and you have raised up against my father's house this day and have killed his sons, 70 men on one stone, and have made Abimelech, the son of his female servant, king over the leaders of Shechem, because he was your relative. If then you have acted in good faith and integrity with Jerubbaal in his house this day, then rejoice in Abimelech, and let him rejoice in you. But if not, let fire come out of Abimelech and devour the leaders of Shechem and Beth Millo, and let fire come out of the leaders of Shechem and from Beth Millo and devour Abimelech." And Jotham ran away and fled and went to Beer and lived there because of Abimelech his brother. And so we have Jotham's parable here. And Jotham here means Yahweh is perfect or honest. And so here this guy gives an honest account of what's going to take place. And so the one who got away, the last legitimate son of Gideon, gives this warning or curse or parable to the city of Shechem and also to Abimelech. And it's important because he makes this on Mount Gerizim, which is highly symbolic. You may say, well, why is this important? Well, Shechem becomes the chief city of the Sumerians. Mount Gerizim is where they build their temple. That's where the Samaritans worship. Moses addressed the children of Israel on Mount Gerizim. Joshua built an altar to the Lord on Mount Gerizim. And Jesus passed by it at least on one occasion and probably multiple times during his earthly ministry. And so he gives this parable, which is the first parable that is recorded in the Bible. Now, parables in the Old Testament are rare, but they do take occasion. One of the more well-known takes place by Nathan. Anybody remember the parable Nathan gives to David? No, not that one. About the lamb. That's exactly right. And so he gives a parable about the ewe lamb. And David gets so mad, he says, this person done this, it should die. And Nathan says, you are the man, right? In 2 Samuel chapter 12. And so here we see another parable in the Bible. Of course, who spoke with the most parables in the Bible? Jesus, right? And so Jesus is by far gives the most parables. But in the New Testament, sometimes you do get parables from the New Testament writers. There's a few by James in the book we studied in our Sunday morning class a few weeks ago. And so, but this is the first parable in the Bible. And so this was a very common way that Jewish teachers taught, both in the time of Jesus, but also in the Mishnah you can read. Parables are just one of the favorite ways that Jews like to teach, even to this day. And so he gives a parable in saying, the trees went out to try to anoint the three different types of produce there in the ancient world that was so important to them. First they go out to the olive tree, the fig tree, and the vine tree. These are the three main staples of the ancient Near East, things that have produce, things that help them survive and live. Those things say, we don't have time for that, and they go to the bramble. And they say, you be our king. And oftentimes it was a very dry vegetation that would often catch fire. And so here Jotham says this relationship that you have with Abimelech and Shechem, it's going to go down in flames. Just like if the trees were to make the bramble bush their king. And so the parable from Mount Gerizim is both symbolic and it's also important. And this is on top of Mount Gerizim. Did anybody remember what I mentioned a few weeks ago when talking about Mount Gerizim? I talked about the temple that was on here, about the Samaritans. Anybody remember what happened to that temple? Huh? Right, they came here, the Samaritans built a temple here, and then there was a Jew by the name of John Hyrcanus about 130 years before Jesus was born. And so you had two temples to Yahweh, right? You had a temple to Yahweh on Mount Gerizim by the Samaritans. You had a temple to Yahweh in Jerusalem by the Jews. The Samaritans and Jews didn't get along with each other. John Hyrcanus goes up to Shechem and to Mount Gerizim, and he kills as many Samaritans as possible. He crucifies them, he enslaves the rest, and then he goes and he takes the temple and he completely destroys it. And these are the ruins of the temple on Mount Gerizim, taken by like a drone that you can actually go and see today. There are still Samaritans in Shechem. It is mostly a Jewish population, but there still are about 200 Samaritans in Shechem. There's only 700 Samaritans left in the world. And so very, very small ethnic group of people. So interesting. John Hyrcanus goes up there in 130, and he decimates the population, and they've never recovered. And so there's only 700 Samaritans alive in the world today. Most of them living in and around Jerusalem. And so what is our takeaway here? God's punishment is inevitable. And so Jotham stands on Mount Gerizim, and he says, look, this is going to go in flames. God is not honored. He's not pleased. You guys, first of all, are worshiping a pagan god. You order somebody who's not even a legitimate son of Abimelech to be your king. And Jotham says that God is not going to be honored by this murderous act. And you guys are going to feel the brunt of that. And so Abimelech's reign over time is rejected. And so let's read verses 22 through 33 of our text. Abimelech ruled over Israel 3 years, and God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem. And the leaders of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech, that the violence done to the 70 sons of Jerubbaal might come and their blood be laid on Abimelech, their brother who killed them, and on the men of Shechem who strengthened his hand to kill his brothers. And the leaders of Shechem put men in ambush against him on the mountaintops, and they robbed all who passed by them along the way, and it was told to Abimelech. And Gaal, the son of Ebed, moved into Shechem with his relatives, and the leaders of Shechem put confidence in him. And they went out into the field and gathered grapes from the vineyards, and trod them and had a festival. And they went to the house of their God, and ate and drank, and reveled or reviled Abimelech. And Gaal, the son of Ebed, said, Who is Abimelech? And who are we of Shechem that we should serve him? Is he not the son of Jerubbaal? And is not Zebul his officer? Serve the men of Hamor, the father of Shechem. But why should we serve him? Would that this people would be under my hand, and that I would remove Abimelech. I would say to Abimelech, Increase your army and come out. When Zebul, the ruler of the city, heard the words of Gaal, the son of Ebed, his anger was kindled, and he sent messengers to Abimelech secretly, saying, Behold, Gaal, the son of Ebed, and his relatives have come to Shechem, and they are stirring up the city against you. Now therefore go by night, you and the people who are with you, and set an ambush in the field. Then in the morning, as soon as the sun rises, rise early and rush the city. And when he and the people who are with him come out against you, you may do to them as your hand sees fit. And so Abimelech's reign is rejected. He's only been ruling for 3 years, very short amount of time, and the people of Shechem have had enough. It says that God sent an evil spirit. Something takes place. Abimelech is a ruthless individual. Maybe he's been too strong with the people of Shechem. A man comes in and he starts taking the money, right? In the ancient world, a ruler received taxes. It's kind of the same way here. Money's power. And so he starts taking the money from these traders, from these people going in. He's on the mountaintops. He's raiding different people. And so Zebul, who is the leader of the city, who is loyal to Abimelech, lets him know, hey, there's a guy here with his brothers. They've kind of taken over the town. He's stirring up a revolt. You're going to want to get here as soon as you can. And so it goes, they say, you know what? Why should we have a half Canaanite, half Israelite to rule over us? I mean, yeah, it seemed like a good option back then, 3 years ago, whenever we were going to say, we're going to have a full-blooded Israelite rule over us or a half-blood, half-Canaanite. But now we have the option of, why not have a full-blooded Canaanite? And so they no longer see him as one of their own. Why is that? The text doesn't really say. And so they attack his income. And so the less power you have, the less money. The less money you have, less power. Why is money so important to Abimelech's reign?
Well, if you're hiring soldiers,
Yeah.
they want to fight for you.
Yeah. If your army doesn't fight for you because it believes in you, if it doesn't fight for you because it believes in your cause, it just fights for a paycheck. Well, when the money runs out, where do the soldiers go? somewhere else. And so Abimelech's got to stop this, and he's got to stop it fast. Because the longer this goes on, the more his power and his prestige is going to be put into jeopardy. And so our takeaway here is misplaced trust will burn you every time. And this is exactly what the parable of Jotham was trying to say. My mom told me when I was a kid, if someone cheats on you, if someone cheats with you, they will eventually cheat with you. If somebody steals with you, they will eventually steal from you. You know, the old saying, there is no honor among thieves. And so Abimelech, connived and schemed and murdered with the leaders of Shechem. Well, if the leaders of Shechem were willing to steal, connive, murder, and scheme with Abimelech, they will connive, scheme, and murder Abimelech. And so when we put our trust, bad company corrupts good morals, but also, bad company is just a bad place to play. If you lay with a dog, what do you get? Fleas, right? And this is kind of the ancient version of that parable, which is actually kind of a parable or a metaphor in and of itself. Metaphor? Simile? No? Okay, whatever. Right. And so here you have Abimelech's war and then his death. And so let's read verses 34 through 49. I tell you what, let's read verses 34 through 44. And let's break this up a little bit. So Abimelech and all of the men who were with him rose up by night and set an ambush against Shechem in 4 companies. And Gaal the son of Ebed went out and stood in the entrance of the gate of the city. And Abimelech and the people who were with him rose from the ambush. And when Gaal saw the people, he said to Zebul, "Look, people are coming down from the mountaintops." And Zebul said to him, "You mistake the shadows of the mountains for men." And Gaal spoke again and said, "Look, people are coming down from the center of the land, and one company is coming from the direction of the diviner's oak." And then Zebul said to him, "Where is your mouth now? You who said, 'Well, who is Abimelech, that we should serve him? Are not the people whom you despised? Go out now and fight with them." And Gaal went out with the head of the leaders of Shechem and fought with Abimelech. And Abimelech chased him, and he fled before him. And many fell wounded up to the entrance of the gate. And Abimelech lived at Arumah. And Zebul drove out Gaal and his relatives, so they could not dwell at Shechem. On the following day, the people went out of the field, and Abimelech was told, and he took his people and divided them into 3 companies. And he set an ambush in the fields, and he took and saw the people coming out of the city, so he rose against them, and he killed them. Now, the interesting thing here about Abimelech is that he attacks Shechem, and he uses a similar strategy to his father. Now, of course, his father's actions against the Midianites were legendary. Everybody talked about him. I mean, it pretty much made Gideon a king during his lifetime. And the interesting thing here is that Abimelech pretty much uses the exact same strategy his dad used. He takes his men, he divides them up into 4 companies. Gideon divided up his in how many companies? Remember? 3. And they say, Isaac, 4 is not 3. No, but it's close. And if you look what happens the next day, he divides up his companies again. And guess how many he divides them into? 3. He comes down from the mountaintop and attacks them in a lower lying valley. It's the exact same thing that Gideon does. And so here Abimelech uses the same strategy that his father did. And then we can see, starting in verse 44 and following. Let's read that passage. And let's start at verse 45. And Abimelech fought against the city all that day, and he captured the city and killed the people who were in it. And he razed the city and sowed it with salt. Spreading salt over a city was to render it barren and worthless for the production of agriculture. This was famously done, supposedly, by conquering armies in the ancient world. There is one incident that is more famous historically than any other. Does anybody know? Anybody who's a history buff? The most famous salt sowing expedition of time? Anybody? It happened after the Third Punic War. Now who knows? The ancient city of Carthage. Anybody ever heard of Hannibal? Yeah, the guy who took the elephants over the Alps down into, actually captured the city of Rome. The Romans went into Carthage, which is in North Africa. They defeated the Carthaginians, and they sacked the city. And historically, supposedly, they salted the city. Now, why would you do that? Yeah, it's hard to grow crops whenever they're covered in salt, right? It makes the soil untenable for crops. And so some have said that actually never happened. and that medieval folklore actually took what happened in Judges chapter 9 and reappropriated it to what happened in the Third Punic Wars and said the Romans did that to Carthage, but it never happened. But people just used the illustration of what happened with Abimelech and Shechem for the Romans and Carthaginians. And so maybe that was the case and maybe it wasn't. But anyways, this is the only time in the Bible where this is mentioned. Let's continue reading at verse 46. When all the leaders of the tower of Shechem heard it, they entered the stronghold of the house of Elbereth. And Abimelech was told that all the leaders of the tower of Shechem were gathered together, and Abimelech went up to Mount Zalmon, and he and all the people who were with him. And Abimelech took an axe in his hand and cut it down a bundle of brushwood, and he took it up and laid it on the shoulder, and he said to the men, "You do what you have seen me do, and hurry." So every one of the people cut down a bundle and followed Abimelech and put it against the stronghold, and they set the stronghold on fire over them. So that the people of the tower of Shechem also died, about 1,000 men and women. And so he burned the citadel. Now in these ancient cities, you would have had the walled cities, and inside the walled cities, you would have had a citadel, or the strongest fortification for the most wealthy and the most powerful. This is not an ancient Near Eastern thing. You can go over to Europe and see cities that were built in the 1700s. Same thing. You have a walled city. Inside the walled city, you have a fortification. Maybe it's a castle. Maybe it's just a structure where you can protect yourself in case they get inside the city walls. Well, they get inside, and what are they going to do? Abimelech doesn't have time for a siege, so he goes and he gets a bunch of brushwood and actually burns it down and kills 1,000 people inside. And so it is interesting here that he completely decimates it. He symbolically sows salt. It's the only time in the Bible. Sorry about that. And I just released some. Well, anyways, we can go ahead. The interesting thing here is Gideon is Abimelech is fulfilling God's will. What was God's will for the Israelites? To do to the people of Canaan. Kill them. Drive them out. Abimelech is actually more successful than any of the judges, and they never took Shechem. It was a Canaanite stronghold. But Abimelech does. He's not trying to fulfill God's word or his law. He's not trying to honor Yahweh. He's just really mad. But it's interesting that God takes someone, even unbeknownst to him, who is actually accomplishing his will. God's will is going to be accomplished. It doesn't matter what man wants to do about it. He's going to see it to fruition. And here, you can say by maybe providence or even just by circumstance, God's will is actually being carried out by Abimelech here in this passage. And so Abimelech gets the big head, and then he goes, and the rest of the chapter, verses 50 through 57, will close it out. Then Abimelech went to Thebes, and he camped against Thebes and captured it. But there was a strong tower within the city, just like the last city in Shechem. And all the men and women and all the leaders of the city fled to it and shut themselves in, and they went up to the roof of the tower. So right now, it's looking like the exact same thing as Shechem. He's done this to Shechem. He goes to the next city, and he's thinking, I've already done this once. This is easy. I've already figured this out. And so he's got the big head. He's going up to the gate. And Abimelech came to the tower and fought against it and drew near to the door of the tower to burn it with fire. And a certain woman threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. Then he called quickly to the young man, his armor-bearer, and said to him, "Draw your sword and kill me, lest they say of me, a woman killed him. And the young man thrust him through, and he died. And when the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, everyone departed to his home. Thus God returned the evil of Abimelech, which he committed against his father, in killing his 70 brothers. And God also made all the evil of the men of Shechem return to their heads, and upon them came the curse of Jotham, the son of Jerubbaal." And so it was interesting here that he is killed by a woman. And so in the ancient world, your death was symbolic. It was important how you died. This is an ancient Near Eastern thing that's even common today. In a 2015 article published in The Independent, it interviewed the Kurdish women's military, and the 21-year-old military commander Telhidin said talking about ISIS, they think they're fighting in the name of Islam. They believe if someone from Daesh or ISIS is killed by a Kurdish girl, they won't go to heaven. So they're afraid of girls. How you died said something about who you were. Now, whether ISIS believes that if you're killed by a woman, you won't go and get your 70 virgins, whatever, I don't know. But that's just what she said in this article. But it's interesting here because a woman proved to be the deliverer in Jael, and here this unnamed woman is the deliverer for these people here in this town. And so the writer of Judges ascribes his fate to God. It said God punished Abimelech and God punished the Shechemites. And so it's interesting here, the connection between the two. Abimelech is Israel's first king. Remember what I said. Who's the other first king of Israel? Saul, right? How do both of them die? Is it similar? Don't both of them ask their armor bearer to run them through with the sword? Right? One so he won't die by the hand of a woman, and one so he won't die by the hand of pagans, foreigners. And so you have the unofficial first king of Israel and the official first king of Israel both dying in shame, asking their young armor bearers to basically commit, not suicide, but to run them through with the sword. And so there's an interesting connection between these two. And so as our time is growing short, here's a millstone in the ancient world that would have been rolled over the top and crushed his skull, as you can see. This is the citadel kind of in Shechem. This is much later than the time we're talking about, but this would have kind of been like what was taking place where the millstone would have been thrown from. And so you can see that's probably at least 30, 40 feet high. And so if you've got a 30-pound millstone falling 40 feet, you can see how that would be detrimental to your health. And so...
He's a strong woman. He was done too.
What's
That dude had the skull crushed and still able to communicate to it.
Yeah. It was. He was definitely on his last leg, though, right? Metaphorically, figuratively. And so God's plan is best. If the people of Israel would have listened to God's plan, He would have blessed them. They would have been safe. But instead, they looked for leaders like Abimelech to follow. Even though Abimelech was probably a Canaanite worshiper, he definitely took money from a pagan temple. Even though he seemed to be a wretched human being, the Israelites were willing to follow him, but the Israelites weren't willing to follow God. And so we've got to be sure that we make sure that God's plan is best and that we're looking to follow Him instead. And so if you look here at the book of Judges, there's a bad pattern that follows after Gideon. And Gideon, you kind of see a shift. Abimelech's violent rule. Then you have Jephthah, who is basically just a bandit. And after Jephthah, it ends in civil war. Samson's career is followed by violence, which also includes a civil war. And then there is no relief, and the book of Judges closes in chaos. And so for the rest of the book of Judges, you will see the Israelites have no peace. They're constantly fighting amongst themselves. They're fighting with those on the outside. And you won't see until the time of David that you really see a unification come to be with the people of God. And even when David comes to power, it's still not unified because the northern tribes don't even recognize David as being king until he goes and he beats them in a war, basically a civil war himself. And so, any questions or comments on Judges 9 and the biblical character of Abimelech? No? All right. Next week, I'll be out of the country. And so Rob Huey will have our lesson for next week. I know he'll do a great job. His aunt Glow in Lewisburg today was telling me how great of a job that he does preaching. And I said, well, good. He's filled in for me a couple of times, speaking but not preaching. So, I'll get that set up. And I know he'll do a great job. And then the next week, we'll talk about Jephthah. Anybody know what Jephthah's daughter, right? What does Jephthah make a promise? First thing, that's right. Jephthah says, if you give me victory, the first thing that I see come out of my gate, I'll sacrifice. What's the first thing that comes out of his gate? So in 2 weeks, we'll talk about, did Jephthah sacrifice his daughter? And if he did, what kind of sacrifice was it? And did he actually sacrifice his daughter in means of killing her? So a little preview for 2 weeks away. We'll talk about that and what the text says. And so if that's all, we'll close the prayer. Thank you so much. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for your word and for the lessons it teaches us. We're so thankful for the characters that we can look to try to emulate in our lives, like your son, the apostles, those faithful to you. Dear Heavenly Father, we're also thankful for the examples given to us of those to not follow who are unfaithful. And Lord, as we look at the character of Abimelech tonight, please help us to have a stronger resolve to follow you, to not have a selfish heart or ambition to lift ourselves up, but to humble ourselves before you. And as your word says, you will lift us up. Dear Heavenly Father, please be with us as we go out throughout this week. Help us to be good examples to those around us and help lead people to you. And dear Heavenly Father, many of us will be traveling for fall break, and we ask and pray that you please be with us and keep us safe. And we're so thankful for the blessing of your Son. It's in His name we pray. Amen.